Hello, everyone. For the second time in a week, we find it necessary to top our discussion, which was taped last Friday, given the seismic historic events of today, Sunday, and the withdrawal by Joseph Biden and his endorsement of Vice President Kamala Harris. We're so lucky that we already had on our episode one of the best, most trenchant historical scholars of Congress, as well as students of current congressional and political operations. That would be Norm Ornstein. Norm has graciously come back to talk a little bit about this thunderbolt. Norm, thank you for being here.
Of course, sir.
So let's start. We had all more or less predicted this in our Friday discussion. Maybe start there. Why was this, in retrospect, a sort of forced play and something that more or less had to happen?
So once we saw the debate, and it focused even more attention on Biden's age and condition. And remember, that started before the debate. I think the New York Times had 30 articles reflecting on Biden's age. The debate underscored not just that he's old, but raised questions about whether he could complete another 4-year term, whether the debate performance was a one-off, and if it happened again further down the road, would be disastrous. So it set in motion, I think, a decision that took a while for prominent Democrats, not just the ones running for election to the House and Senate, but basically the party establishment.
Right.
To take a careful look at this and see, as most of them did, that this just was not going to work with Biden there. And, to add another twist to it, Harry, once we began to see prominent people publicly say Joe Biden has to step back, if Biden refused to do so, it added already a huge amount of ammunition to the questions raised about his age and capability. So it couldn't go on like this. The writing was on the wall, and it was only a question of when that would result in a Biden decision that he had to draw back and withdraw from the nomination to run for president for a second term earlier, or let it stretch out a few days.
Yeah, and this was about the day people pointed to, and I totally agree. Once Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, Adam Schiff, everyone has come out so firmly, and that's a political risk each of them took. For him to stay the course in some way would have been the final chapter on a really impressive record in public service and a tenure as president among the most successful in the last 100 years. It would have been either bucking those odds, and if he lost, God help him, or having just what we're hearing today from Nancy Pelosi and others, the patriot, the selfless man doing what's best for the country. But let me just zero in. I think there's a lot of people's mindset, I would say it's my own, was, does this improve the chances overall? And there is excitement and focus on Kamala Harris, but I'm thinking of Lyndon Johnson in 1968. I'm thinking of other cases where just at the decision point, somebody big steps aside, and what history records, and we are clearly in a historian's paradise here. They're going to be writing about this for generations. So there's now this sort of buoyancy, but how worried are you that it kind of plays as a sort of loser's gesture that, in fact, doesn't change the basic dynamic with Donald Trump?
So let's first talk about 1968. And what I would say there, Harry, is that if Biden had refused to back out, given what we've seen with this dynamic, the Democratic convention might have looked like the one in Chicago in 1968, which was really an awful scene, a deeply divided party that would have come out of the convention with the opposite of a convention bump. This now gives Democrats unity and buoyancy. And while I would still expect that there will be some demonstrations in Chicago where the convention is, like 1968, Grant Park, other places, mostly coming from Muslim Americans and some young progressives protesting policy towards Gaza. You're going to see on the convention floor, I believe, a completely united and enthusiastic party. And one of the things that's going to happen is, remember 1968, Lyndon Johnson would not even come close to showing up at that convention.
Yeah, and it was months before. That's right. That's right. Biden's going to have a speech here that's going to bring down the rafters, right?
We are going to see a tumultuous, rapturous response to Biden that I suspect is going to be greater than we have seen with any other president coming into a convention. And he will be hailed as the hero. A good part of the convention will be talking about the remarkable record he's had as president. He will be bathed in love. And I think we're going to see a united party, which we would not have seen otherwise. Now, is the path smooth ahead? It never is. And, Kamala Harris is the only choice effectively Democrats had. She has been tested as a presidential candidate, even if she failed. She knows what it's like. She is a seasoned person in the White House and on the campaign trail. She has been out there, especially dealing with the issue of abortion, with the post-Dobbs decision, the Handmaid's Tale that we might face ahead. And we'll see, I think, probably a strong reaction, a positive one, to whoever her running mate happens to be. But, there's going to be $100 million or $200 million spent trying to slime her. I'm sure that the Republicans have done a lot of work digging into finding things about her record as a prosecutor, as a senator, as a vice president. And whatever they have, they will double down and lie about even more of it. So it's not going to be an easy path, but it's a very different path. And one of the interesting elements here is the Republicans and Trump were going to run mostly on Biden being incapable of serving because of his age and mental condition. Guess who now is going to have a focus and spotlight on age and mental condition?
The oldest candidate ever in our history, right? Donald Trump.
Yes.
And by the way, I've seen him close up. Not a healthy guy. Norm, you're making it seem like a fait accompli. Let me say, by the way, that in very short order, Jim Clyburn came out for Kamala Harris and a very big power broker because of his role in 2020 with Biden. Jamie Raskin, who one might have thought was a candidate. Pelosi, perhaps the pivotal figure. It's now, is it, in your view, a fait accompli? Kamala Harris is the Democrats' nominee?
I believe that that's the case. There's one differing voice out there that I have seen. Oddly enough, it's Barack Obama. The Washington Post editorial page, which has gone very much downhill in my judgment, has an editorial saying it has to be an open convention. Well, if you're a journalist, you'd love an open convention.
Right.
If you're a Democrat, you wouldn't. So I think almost everybody who matters will fall in line behind Harris. I expect we'll see that from the other potential nominees like Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, Cory Booker. We're going to see, I think, a united Democratic Party because there's an understanding that Harris is their only real choice right now. And then there's the other factor that we've mentioned before, which is there is a Biden-Harris campaign committee that has a ton of money, which only Harris can access directly. Otherwise, you'd have to give it to the national committee, the state parties. They could give a tiny part of it back, but you'd have to start from scratch raising money. You'd have to redo all of the contracts that they have for offices around the country, for paid personnel, their staffers in the different states. So this makes it smooth and easy. And
the alternative, I'll just say, it's not, you'd have to choose someone and introduce them to the country, and it would almost have to be in an open convention. Let me ask you, in your role as parliamentary expert, so how will it physically work? Let's say it's true, everyone very quickly assembles behind Kamala Harris. Does the actual anointment as nominee take place before the convention? And is it a love-in for Harris and Biden the way the Republicans in Milwaukee just staged 11 for Trump and Vance?
It's possible still that they will follow through on their plan to have a remote vote by the delegates before the convention. They're going to take a look at whether there is anything in state laws that might create a problem there. There was potentially in Ohio, but Ohio resolved that otherwise. Either way, I'm not sure it matters. I believe that there will be a unified, enthusiastic response at the convention for Harris. And, there's still questions. One question is who's going to run the campaign? How much will this be a Biden-Harris campaign team that is mostly a Biden team that will continue forward? We don't know that. And there could be some tensions. Not everybody in the Biden campaign team is fond of Harris, and that's a question of...
Let me ask you briefly about that. And they were not alone when they were vetting her. Biden was heard to say, why does everyone dislike her so much? Why has she been such a unpopular vice president? And does she get a full reset now and a second look?
I think there will be a reset. Now, the whys, it's hard for any vice president to stand out. There have been exceptions to that. Biden was one, Al Gore was another. In this case, I think she made some missteps early on in her tenure. Whether it was bad staff advice or her own decisions, I can't say. But what I will say is this. She was given by Biden two major portfolios at the beginning, the border and the democracy issue. And reaction to that, I know from her staff, was, why do we have to get the tough stuff? When in fact, the reaction should have been great, because this will show that we're up to the task. And I think the relative absence of energy and focus outside on the issues where she could have claimed them as her own hurt her at the beginning. She's made a comeback, I have to say. She's been out there a lot. If you followed her on the campaign trail in the last few months, she's the one who has taken up the post-Dobbs battle and done it very, very skillfully. She has embraced the border issue in a way that she didn't back when she was first offered it. And she has been very good in her speeches in articulating why Donald Trump is a disaster. I would bet you that she will be able to debate Trump and do a better showing than we have seen, than we saw with what was a clearly horrible night for Joe Biden. So I think she's got a chance now. Most people just don't know much about her. They just know that she has had a high profile. She has a chance to redefine herself, and I think a chance to get Democrats who have not been energized. The only thing that's energized Democrats in the last several months, for large numbers of them, has been the prospect of Donald Trump emerging. And there's, from many groups of voters, some people of color, African Americans and Hispanic Americans, a lot of young progressive voters, it's been a meh at best towards this race. I think there is a real chance now to get a much more energized Democratic Party. And there's a chance now, and this is the big thing, Harry, to turn this election and frame it as not a referendum on Biden, but a referendum on whether we're going to have a decent, honest, small d democratic society from the top with a president, or whether we are going to descend into the abyss of a corrupt, vicious dictatorship. And if that's the frame of the election, Democrats win.
Yeah, that's my sort of final question. And, look, it's a Mr. Unity graciousness. Donald Trump from the Milwaukee convention came out when Biden stepped aside and called him the worst president by far of all time. And, he's back deeply in the gutter. Here's my sort of final question for you. And, of course, there's no right answer, but I wonder what your surmise is. June 26th, an extremely close race, Trump having a bit of an advantage in some of the swing states, but very close, and all the focus on a very small cadre of potential voters. everything goes awry with that debate. And then since then, Trump, takes a bullet or a piece of glass, depending on who you're talking to, a pretty robust convention, which shows him having completely captured the party and basically ousted all, even Reagan Republicans and the like, Mitch McConnell on the enemies list. So coming in with a certain head of steam, and we talked about this on our episode. Does Biden's stepping aside and Harris's stepping to the fore kind of reset the table to where we were on the 26th before the debate, so it's the same focus as you see it, and it's back to this very sort of small grain set of calculations?
I think this is a real reset. And a part of what is good for Democrats is we're just out of that Republican convention. And the focus had shifted to Democrats in disarray. Now the focus changes to Democrats in array, but it also means that the post-convention sort of glow for Republicans, which already had been dimmed significantly by Trump's pretty bizarre speech. And now we see that despite his first 5 minutes talking about unity, he's back to being the same old divisive, vicious, clearly stumbling Donald Trump. It gives Democrats a real chance to reset and reframe the election. And I think it's critical for Democrats in the lead up to their convention over the next 2 weeks to really make sure that they can, before anybody else does, define Kamala Harris, build that level of excitement, show that this is a dramatic turnaround for the Democratic Party, and lead into their convention with a little bit of momentum. And then I think it's going to be possible to get a bounce. One of the things that we're already seeing, and I think we're going to see even more, there's going to be a flood of money coming into the Democratic Party now. All those people who said we're going to hold off providing funds until we see how this plays out are going to be unleashed. There will be more money coming in. My guess is Harris is going to get out on the trail, and she is now going to have huge crowds, and her speeches are going to be covered in a different way. So I think this is a big plus for Democrats. We're seeing a real pivot here, and that pivot, if Harris follows through as I expect she will over the next few weeks, and the Democratic Party's campaign will, to define her before Republicans can, to start to build that momentum toward the convention, we'll see a real reset here. And it's not a smooth path ahead. Nobody should believe that we're going to have anything other than a close election. But right now, the number of states in question has been narrowed, and Democrats are on a high, and that's a real change from just a few days ago.
Thank you so much, Norm Ornstein. Now, let's pivot to our still highly relevant discussion that captures the flurry of recent events, including Biden's then anticipated and now realized decision to withdraw from the race. Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. Historians will one day write about these very weeks, which are among the most remarkable in the history of the United States presidency. Bowing to a rising torrent of pressure from leadership within the Democratic Party, President Joe Biden announced yesterday that he is withdrawing his candidacy for president, despite having secured nearly all delegate votes during the primary season. A series of unpredictable and even mind-boggling events, beginning with a disastrous debate against Donald Trump at the end of June, left his candidacy untenable. Rather than facing a very possible defeat against Trump in the fall, Biden now caps his remarkable 50-year record of public service, crowned by one of the most successful presidencies in a century, with an act that will be celebrated as both selfless and patriotic, emblematic of a lifetime of dedication to the public good. Democrats now are aiming for a seamless and orderly transition to a new candidate, but that is easier said than done, and the immediate days ahead remain uncertain. Biden has emphatically endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris, in the hope of a quick resolution and an abrupt return to the campaign against Trump. And many of her most obvious opponents, Josh Shapiro and Jamie Raskin and others, have rushed to second that endorsement. But there are a wealth of other ideas, and while Kamala Harris's candidacy seems to emerge with greater force every hour, still there is no certain path to a party resolution. Biden's historic decision temporarily takes away the focus from an astonishing run of events involving Donald Trump, beginning with the debate between Biden and Trump on June 27th, followed by the assassination attempt just a short week ago, and moving to the triumphant Republican convention. We are living through a tumultuous and intense period that may come to be seen one day as the collective pivot point to a different country. As with other historic short stretches in, say, 1860 or 1896 or 1968, we are waking up to events, some meticulously orchestrated, some wholly unpredictable, that are challenging to fully grasp in the moment, yet undeniably important. In a way, it's exciting to watch and live through, but so is the Indy 500. And the ensuing political upheaval could eclipse the turmoil of even the most decisive periods in United States history. To analyze where things stand and where they may be going in one of the most volatile and consequential political landscapes as this country has ever seen, we welcome three of the nation's most prominent and thoughtful commentators. And they are Alisyn Camerota, a journalist, author, anchor, and correspondent for CNN. Throughout her 3 decades in journalism, Alisyn has earned 2 Emmys and many other plaudits for her breaking news coverage of national and international events. In 2017, she published her debut novel, Amanda Wakes Up, selected by NPR as one of the best books of the year, and recently, I think in April, published her memoir, Combat Love. Thanks very much for returning to Talking Feds, Alisyn, and how's it going with Combat Love?
It's going fabulously. I am loving all the book tours. Gen Xers apparently find my unparented story of survival through the 80s to be universal. So I'm having a great time with it.
Terrific. Well, come do a one-on-one with us just on the book.
Love to.
Next, David French, an opinion columnist with the New York Times. He's a former JAG officer deployed to Iraq in 2007. He earned a Bronze Star with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. Since transitioning from full-time law practice to join National Review in 2015, David's focused in particular on the threat of growing polarization in the country, including in his book, Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. Thank you for your service, David French, and thanks as always for joining Talking Feds.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and I just am glad Alisyn is reminding the world of the unparented 80s, because that's my time as well.
And I'm sorry, it was better. And finally, Norm Ornstein, an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a contributing editor for The Atlantic, and co-host of the excellent Words Matter podcast with Dr. Kavita Patel. Norm's a prolific author, including the bestseller One Nation After Trump, etc., and a really great friend to this podcast in particular. Thanks as always, Norm, for joining us.
Of course, Harry. And, I have to say, sadly, that I could talk about the unparented 50s.
Nothing sad about that. All right. Well, as opposed to the rock'em sock'em, soon to be in the history books, crazy week and 3 weeks that we find ourselves in the middle of. So where to even begin? This was from, long ago, the Republicans' week, and it began with Trump's announcement of his vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, 39-year-old think that's the third youngest VP candidate ever, Ohio Senator. Let's start there with what the selection says about Trump. And David, I'll start with you because you've said from the beginning of the process, the question is, was he going to try to get someone who could maybe reach 15 of the voters left in the middle, or somebody who would help him double down on the MAGA ethos and ideology? What's your sense of what he did and what it shows about him?
So, Harry, first, are you sure we have 15 voters in the middle? Because I was thinking it was more like 6 or 7, maybe.
I'm taking a real-time poll. We're over 10. We stay over 10.
Yeah, the way I think of J.D. Vance is he is the selection of a person who's very confident he's going to win. And it's a selection of a person who's looking down the line to the next phase, what his legacy is going to be. This is not a pick of somebody who's going to reach wavering voters. Look, people say, well, he might have some appeal in the Midwest. Well, Governor Mike DeWine ran about 19 points ahead of him in the 2022 election. And DeWine is a much more sort of normie Republican than J.D. Vance is. J.D. Vance ran almost 400,000 votes behind DeWine. This is not a guy who really builds the tent. He's a guy that you double down with. And it's very clear to me that Trump, A, is feeling really confident right now for a lot of good reasons, and that B, he really does want to put the last sort of hammer, the last nails in the coffin of Reagan conservatism. This is just a dramatically different party than it used to be. And J.D. Vance, his selection indicates that at least the MAGA wing, which controls the party, has every intention of doubling down and not letting Reaganism back under the tent at all.
I hear David, but I think with Trump, as always, it's a little less strategic and it's a little less philosophical than that. I think it's cosmetic. I think it's really simple. He likes how J.D. Vance looks.
Beard notwithstanding, yeah.
No, beard notwithstanding. He's fashioning himself as Don Jr.'s mini-me or whatever. So he likes that. That looks like somebody that Donald Trump knows and likes. He likes that J.D. Vance's wife looks a little different, but is very pretty. That is very important to Donald Trump. And he likes his pedigree. He loves that he went to Yale Law School. I mean, I think Donald Trump is a simple man. Those are things that he has said and telegraphed a million times are important to him. So to me, that's why he wins over Doug Burgum. And also that I guess it says that Donald Trump is listening to Don Jr. and to Tucker Carlson.
I want to add one element that to me is the more compelling one. We had a lickspittle Olympics going on here for a couple of months. And that was not making your decision while you see which of the potential candidates will kowtow more. Which one are you confident will not be a Mike Pence, where when you ask your vice president to do something illegal, no matter how illegal, no matter how immoral, the answer will be right on it, boss. And J.D. Vance was the better choice. I think it could well have been Kristi Noem if she hadn't shot herself in the foot after shooting her dog and her goat in the head. But with that gone, Marco Rubio, I think he believed was too soft, too weak, little Marco. And Doug Burgum, who might have been more articulate, more experienced, I don't think he felt he could trust Doug Burgum to do the illegal stuff. So Vance is there because he showed over and over and over again he will do anything for Donald Trump. Now, I think, what both David and Alisyn said is true, but to me, there's one fundamental here. He just did not want another experience with Mike Pence. And remember also, this is a guy who said he'll fire the generals who wouldn't do anything illegal or immoral, so he can put in generals who, when he invokes the Insurrection Act and says shoot to kill, they're not going to talk him out of it. So it's frightening in a whole host of ways.
These are three really distinct, really important points, but I think there's basic consensus that they are three good points. David's confidence, Alisyn's simple man, and Norm's lickspittle Olympics. Can we patent that phrase somehow? Let me just follow up briefly on what does the Vance choice and his speech suggest about what a potential Trump-Vance White House could look like.
I do think that what we have seen is that if you go to the Trump speech, which after the first 10 or 15 minutes that were, I thought, genuinely pretty gripping, turned into a very, very boring version of his rally speech, but all playing the greatest hits. And then when you go to J.D. Vance, which J.D. Vance is typically a better speaker than he was at the convention. I thought that speech was pretty flat and boring, but all of them were greatest hits compilations where they're doing two things at once. One thing is they're trying to create a series of false memories about the Trump term. This was a big theme of that convention, false memories. They're trying to create an impression that America was more peaceful in 2020, of all things, than it is now, which is just crazy. And they're trying to create an impression that Trump just had the world under control. When we remember, we lurched from crisis to crisis internationally during Trump's term. So they're trying to create a false narrative about the past to win over those nostalgia voters.
Probably every word of his speech had to be cleared through the Trump people, right?
Oh, for sure, for sure. But, the rest of it is just greatest hits for the MAGA base. So you've got the immigration hits. You've got the claims that everything's bad in the world because of Biden weakness. And then you have just the incredibly extravagant Trump promises. At one point, I was counting up, not only was he going to remove essentially all of the illegal immigrants from the United States, but he was also going to cure cancer and Alzheimer's. Huge if true. I mean, this was greatest hits of Trump and trying to create like a series of false memories. And this is what we witnessed.
Yeah. I mean, and also I just want to say not only false memories, the total revisionist history of J.D. Vance. I mean, J.D. Vance, as we will all remember, David, you, I believe, interviewed him right when Hillbilly Elegy come out. I read the transcript. And he, as we know, said that Trump is America's Hitler. He's a moral disaster. He's a total fraud. He felt the need to apologize for Trump to other countries by saying, Lord, help us.
I can't stomach Trump. I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him. He's cultural heroin. What's their strategy for getting past that?
Well, bootlicking toadyism. That also works to get past that. But it does require the audience to also have a mind eraser about the times that he had said all that. He went in and scrubbed his Twitter feed. So all the times that he liked
literally, yeah,
saying that this is America's Hitler, he, did away with those things. But David, I'm just curious, when you interviewed him back when Hillbilly Elegy was such a smash hit, what was your impression of J.D. Vance?
Well, so I've known him since he really since 2016. And so by 2020, when I interviewed him about Hillbilly Elegy, the movie, he was already in the process of making this change. And so when I first met him in 2016, he was using stronger rhetoric than I did against Donald Trump. I've never compared Donald Trump to Hitler, for example. So he was even stronger, using stronger rhetoric than I did. And then by 2020, already the change was happening. You could see him moving in that much more populist direction, taking on the Republican establishment. Then by 21, 22, it felt like the change was about as complete as it could possibly get when he's campaigning with Marjorie Taylor Greene, of all people, for a Senate election. And here's where I'm going to disagree with some people. There are some folks who view JD as the ultimate grifter. I actually think he is something a little bit more dangerous than that. I think he's got the zeal of the new convert. I think that he is a convert to this cause, and I think that he has got all of the zeal of that new convert, and that is what it makes him so aggressive. So all of that aggression that you read towards Trump, comparing him to Hitler, calling him heroin, is now on behalf of Trump with all of that zeal. And Norm's right. There was a contest to see who could abase themselves more to Trump. And it feels like to me it was a photo finish between Rubio and Vance on the debasement category. But Vance, I think, has that zeal of the new convert in a way that Rubio doesn't quite.
Let me make a couple of additional comments on the speeches first. Vance lied about his own background.
Promiscuously.
As you know, David and Alisyn, from reading the book, that first of all, he put a lot of blame on the people in Middletown for the social decline in the book. In the speech, it was they're the victims of big government, big business, and so on. He said he'd been saddled with $120,000 crippling debt from Yale Law School. In the book, he talked about how great it was that they were the cheapest and they gave him the best deal and he was able to escape. So there were lies there. And, what really drove me nuts about the coverage on television was all they talked about was the substance of the speech from the transcript that they had. Nobody pointed out that. On Trump, yes, the first several minutes were compelling, but they were dying to have the shooter be an Antifa guy. And what we now know, we don't know everything, but we know this was a deeply troubled person. I can tell you, we have seen this story over and over, untreated mental illness and easy access to an assault rifle. If anybody else had been reflecting on nearly being shot, they might have reflected on those things. That never came up. He didn't even talk about the shooter at all. Put that aside. You asked Harry about what all this means for a Trump-Vance administration. Here's what we know now about the true believer, as David said. He has lauded Kyle Rittenhouse, the young murderer who went in the aftermath of another police shooting in Wisconsin, went from his home in another state with an assault rifle and other weapons and shot 2 people. Got acquitted and has become a celebrity, but this was somebody out to kill somebody, period. Beyond that, he called for, at different times, a complete national abortion ban, no exceptions. We know that he is at least as fond of Vladimir Putin as Donald Trump is, and that he has said, almost a direct quote, I don't care about Ukraine one way or the other. Now, you put that together with the embrace of deporting 12 million people after sending them to detention camps, and his belittling comments about women, and you put that together with Trump, and what you have is a toxic stew of vicious dictatorship that will destroy our alliances and undermine almost everything that we hold dear in terms of fundamental values of freedom and democracy in the country. I'm holding back a little bit, but that's kind of where I come out.
No. Tell us what you really think. I try hard, and I have for years, to stay away from Hitler metaphors, but it gets harder and harder, or at least, Hungary or Venezuela metaphors, and B, he framed it. But to me, and this is now personal more than journalist, but there was this aspect of, one thinks of Trump as being sort of reviled by his party behind the scenes, but people hobnob to his power. This felt, at least the play in the convention was, tomorrow belongs to me. Just an enthusiasm of an embedded institutional change embraced rather than suffered by all the people who were there. And it's a horrifying prospect.
It's just too bad that Leni Riefenstahl wasn't there to film the whole thing.
Harry, you brought up the Republicans sort of holding their noses or condemning Trump behind closed doors and then going out and praising him. That's old news. I'm not going to say that never happens anymore. It does still happen on occasion. But by and large, the people I know in my life, I live in a very red part of America. My neighborhood is 85% Republican. And, I've seen the change. In 2016, people were legitimately holding their nose to vote for him. In 2020, they're pulling the Mastercraft out and they were in the boat parade, right? And
Mitch McConnell is on the enemies list. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a transition we've seen clearly with our own eyes, and you saw it in the convention, the adoration for him. I'm old enough to remember in 2008, the Republicans making fun of Democrats for really falling for Barack Obama. And McCain had this very memorable ad with the Obama chants in the background, making fun of this hero worship. Well, I will tell you, Democratic hero worship for Obama has nothing on the hero worship on the right for Trump right now. And there was already a strong sense that he was God's chosen man to save this country on the part of especially the religious right. Now, after the assassination attempt, there is, in many people's view, just absolute confirmation that he is God's divine choice to save America. And that's a level of zeal that we have not seen in American politics in my lifetime, anyway.
Trump was known as, I don't know if he's godless, but he certainly never invoked God in any kind of convincing or regular way. And the amount of God talk that he decided to imbue in his RNC speech was, I don't know. I mean, I like talking about God. I like talking about spirituality, but I don't like it when it feels out of the blue and disingenuous. And so it was jarring to me to hear it from Donald Trump, because Donald Trump that's not Bill Clinton talking. This is somebody who doesn't go to church and who doesn't talk about God. And so to hear him say all of that, I found strange and jarring, but I agree with everything you guys are saying. And certainly the zeal that you're talking about, David, it's tribal. I mean, in other words, I don't know if, I guess J.D. Vance has been converted, or does he just like being part of a team? And does he like attaching himself to something where he's now the celebrated cool kid on the team? Because of the talk we're having, I went back to my Hillbilly Elegy book, which hadn't spoken to me, to tell you the truth. When I tried to read it back in whenever it came out, 2016 or whatever, I was reading it because it was a cultural phenomenon, but it hadn't really resonated with me. That's not a subculture that I was that familiar with. And some of the Mama stuff just wasn't. I have such a beloved grandmother myself, and she was so different than Mama that it was hard for me to kind of embrace the whole thing. But I just went back with new eyes, and I almost liked it more now, and I saw it with fresh eyes. And J.D. Vance writes in Hillbilly Elegy, he tells the story of how as a kid he had to adopt these fake personas and alliances to survive different father figures in his life, because his mother kept hooking up with, the drunk or the drug addict or the abusive guy. And so he would take on these different personas to survive with these older guys. And not to be armchair Freud here, but it really rang true of what he's doing now for survival.
That makes so much sense and is so insightful. But I think I kind of compare him, given what David said, to Tucker Carlson. Because we know for years, Tucker didn't believe that shit. And I think when you say it over and over, and it becomes a part of your persona, and you believe it. But the broader point here, and it drove me nuts to hear the television commentators say, the Republican Party's more unified than it's ever been. That's because they wouldn't let anybody in the hall who didn't agree with them, from a former president to a former vice president. But what's also true, and this has been building long before Trump, this is not a party anymore. It's a cult. And with a cult, you either become a true believer or you stay because the fear of being shunned or excommunicated or shot is so great. So we know plenty of people who are there because if they step outside that cult, they're going to be in trouble and their families may be in trouble. I've talked to plenty of House Republicans who left and who still face death threats. And I don't think the country, and certainly not our media covering politics, has come to grips with the degree to which this has moved away from a conservative problem-solving party, a Reagan party, to a cult that is not about coming up with ways to solve problems, but extending its power, imposing its will on the rest of the country, and punishing its adversaries and enemies.
I mean, oldsters like us basically see this in terms of like other movements where the know-nothings or the Whigs or whatever. This is, as David says, the final demise of the Reagan party. I think of Trump as being incredibly insipid, nothing new under the sun, same old, boring, etc. There was an exception here, and it was this religious shit. Pardon the expression, that whispery tone. Where did that was new Donald Trump, those repeated references, the call for a moment of silence, his recounting of the shooting with this sort of religious aura. And one big difference with Clinton is Clinton's talking honestly about his belief. Trump, I don't know. I think it's not so subtle. He's talking honestly or portraying the notion that he's the Messiah. It really is playing, I think, on just that kind of thing, and the taking the bullet and the whole immediate staging of the tableau after that. That, I think, is a little bit of a new sort of page in the Trump playbook, which he has very few of, and it really struck me. Am I being a little bit too alarmed here?
It's not as new as you think, Harry. He's been building towards this, especially when the criminal charges have been filed. He has been sharing some of these memes that show, for example, Jesus sitting next to him at the council table, or that putting himself as the Christ figure where they're coming for you, but I'm in the way. I'm being prosecuted for you. I'm taking this for you. And the assassination attempt, I think, ratchets that up way up. Now, let me be charitable here for a minute and say, look, the guy just had a near-death experience. He came within a fraction of an inch of being shot square in the head. And I'm going to give him some grace on this, that, being sobered by that is a very human thing. I don't think there's evidence that Trump has fundamentally changed as a result of that, as evidenced by the last hour and 20 minutes of his speech. But I will say, coming out subdued, paying a tribute to the firefighter who lost his life, I thought all of that was very appropriate. But then he immediately transitioned back into Donald Trump again. And it was a more sedate Donald Trump. It was all the greatest hits from all of his rallies. There wasn't a turning of the page. And you can say unity 4 or 5 times, but then when you repeat your rally speech, there's not much unity there at all. So I do think that there is a need to be charitable to the man in the immediate aftermath of an assassination attempt. But at the same time, we have to speak clearly about who he is and what he's done. You can hold both of these thoughts in your head at the same time.
I guess I resent the constant question on the news, which Donald Trump is it? Which Donald Trump will govern? Is it the unity Trump because he spoke calmly for 10 minutes? Or is it the other divisive Donald Trump? We know what it is. Let's actually not give ourselves a mind eraser. Let's not pretend that we didn't all live through, those 4 years and beyond. We're always looking for new angles. I understand as a television newscaster, you're always looking for a new angle. That's not one of them that we should be exploring. We know exactly who Donald Trump is.
And I have to say that I was just nauseated by all of the reflections on all of the networks leading up to his speech, that this was a new and different Donald Trump. It is so ridiculous. This is a lifelong narcissistic sociopath. And the idea that even an experience like this, it might sober him for a little bit, it's not going to transform his personality. And let's face it, his relationship to God is, what can I do to make more money out of it?
God, what have you done for me lately? Norm, you've really led the charge with a big theme here that we don't have time to explore, which is the acquiescence of the press in at least this week's hagiography. I want to focus in our remaining minutes. Okay, so stipulate great kind of feeling and a new kind of feeling, not, an actual emphatic love of Trump and the future within the room in Milwaukee. But back to our 15 or 11 people, David. So what's your analysis? There is this heroic tableau. He took a bullet. Maybe it remains forever. We have other problems with Biden, which we'll get to. But the basic question I'd like us to chew over is, we already had 46% of people who seem like they would never vote for Donald Trump. In a really meaningful way, is this a game changer? Is it not just enthusiasm in the room, but at least out of the room enough to make him the decided favorite? Or is it really an insular phenomenon?
Yeah, I would say as you watch Trump speak and as you watch J.D. Vance speak, I would say that I went through what you might now call the Nate Silver progression. Okay, and I'm referring to a series of 3 tweets from Nate Silver last night where he began by saying, hey, this is a solid speech. And then he, in the middle of it, was partial retraction, followed by at the end, full rescind, full retract.
Shoot me now.
93 minutes, longest speech ever. Yeah.
So what we had happen was a situation where Trump had a unique opportunity. This does not happen often in American politics, where he has a chance to come in after an extraordinarily scary event and sort of present himself to the American people in a way that I'm not going to say would end the Democratic campaign. That's way premature to say something like that, but that would absolutely compound the crisis for the Democrats. And he walked up there to the podium and he basically fumbled the ball. After those first few minutes, what happened, the rest of it was not just the longest speech in nominating history, but one of the most boring which is not something you typically say of Donald Trump. You can say outrageous, you can say cruel, you can say sometimes funny, you can say all of those things. But boring is not one word that's typically attached. And so he came across as both boring and also malicious at the same time. And that's not a combination that tends to win over wavering voters. And so I think, and you could see this happen in real time during the speech, folks went from, my gosh, this convention, they're totally unified. They're an all-consuming, world-destroying force. They're the political Borg. And then it turns into, wait a minute, it's still just Donald Trump. He can be beaten. A good campaign can beat this guy. And he went from nearly unstoppable to very stoppable in the course of about 93 minutes.
I don't know what the lasting implications of his speech will be to anybody outside of that room. I don't know if any of us know yet, because I don't know if people just tuned out after 15 minutes because it got tedious. So it's hard to know if he is now inspiring to people that he wasn't. But I do, in the interest of truth-telling and in the interest of fact-checking, I just want to say, I agree he survived a near-death experience, for sure. However, no medical report has been released. We don't know, as we sit here, if it was truly a bullet that pierced his ear or if it was a shattered teleprompter and a piece of glass. And I went back to the transcript of his speech, and they are very, very clever in the transcript of the speech not to say he was hit by a bullet. And you have to go through some rhetorical contortions to not say that he was hit by a bullet, but they don't say that.
And it's sort of amazing that it's up to him whether to release it, right? I talk to people in real time and who know guns. They say, even if it grazes it, the ear is like blown to bits.
I mean, I've covered, sadly, all too many mass shootings. This was a mass shooting. Okay, yes, I guess it's also a political assassination attempt, but 20-year-old with an AR-15? I've seen that movie. I've seen that horror movie. I've seen it a dozen times. I've covered it. But in any event, my point is that this whole narrative, yes, he did survive a near-death experience, for sure. And I'm sure that to David's point, he has changed. But I just want to make sure we have our facts clear on that. As for what the effect will be, I don't know. I really don't know yet. And I don't know what the effect will be. I mean, everything is so up in the air on the other side, on the Democrat side, that who knows what will negate anything.
Fair enough. Well, let me just follow up with you, Alisyn, on how about just this tableau, which he wanted so much, the heroic thing. You know, Reagan goes up 22 points after he's shot, but it goes back down quickly. And it's a very fast-moving campaign, and we're going to have probably some pretty big news. We'll get to that in a moment. And I'll just follow up. To David's point, I take it, but we're talking about people who mostly weren't watching the speech, just as there's something out there that's like, Donald Trump, hero, okay, I can vote. Does the sort of heroic whatever patina last? Or is that last month's news by next month?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how long the legs are, but I definitely think it was impressive. I mean, I do think that tableau is impressive. And if we're a country on iconography and optics, then yeah, it does sway people.
Well, so let's note that we've had plenty of conventions in the past where there's a convention bump for the candidate, but there's a limiting impact. John Kerry was 16 points up after the Democratic convention in Boston, and he did not win. But we're not in an era where there are going to be convention bumps for just the reasons that you and David have suggested, Harry, which is most voters are fixed. Now, having said that, they're not all fixed, and that includes not just the stereotypical college-educated suburban Republicans and independents who are the key in swing states. It's also whether you have a Democratic base that gets charged up. The one thing that may emerge from this convention is more of an enthusiasm among Republicans. But I have to tell you, even though they're supremely confident, they're putting a ton of money into contesting the election outcome because they're not sure. They know from their own polls that Trump still has a ceiling, and that ceiling doesn't get him over the top. He has to do better than that. Democrats are giving him every bit of help with their own shit show going on. But, you know, the key to this election is not just those voters. It's also the enthusiasm of Democratic base that is now not enthusiastic, going through this minefield if Biden withdraws and they don't go with Harris, you may see even more people kind of bitter, who knows where they go. You have a lot of young progressives unhappy over Gaza and other issues. But what they have to do is find a way to change this election and pivot from it being a referendum on Biden and the country as it is right now, which is a losing one, I believe, for them, despite his incredible record as a president and what he accomplished and where the economy is compared to what they said it was. But it has to be, for Democrats, a referendum on decency, integrity, and democracy. And if they can't get a candidate set and begin to work to unite behind it and turn their own convention in 4 weeks into that kind of pivot with an enthusiastic crowd at the convention pushing it, then we're going to have a whole lot of trouble avoiding that vicious autocracy.
It's sort of always been the Trump strategy to act like a winner and the winning will follow in some sense. So, of course, it makes sense for that overall strategy to have a swagger and it just be that swagger rather than anything concrete. Holy crap. Let's just go right to the $64,000 question. This episode will drop Monday, so it's half a lifetime in the context of these sort of death vigils. So I don't think anyone is required to predict even the near future. But let's just start with where things stand, because my sense is literally in the last 12 hours, I feel I have a little bit of knowledge, and I think you guys have a lot of knowledge in decoding the sorts of statements in the press that are all polite, but to me are saying very strongly, everybody who's the leadership of the party is saying, you got to go. A, do you agree? And B, whatever he says, whatever Obama says about this being Biden's choice, is that, practically speaking, just too big a tide for him to try to push back on and be, against the entire party leadership, very different from the country, importantly, in the next few months? Where are we? How do you read the sort of stories coming out as the sophisticated journalists you all are?
I feel like I have maybe a little bit of an advantage in evaluating the situation because I'm a longtime college football fan, Harry. And here's what I mean. If you have ever seen the final spiral of an SEC football coach, this looks a lot like it, where you first have the whispers and the coach is saying, I'm not going anywhere. And then the whispers become leaks and the coach says, I'm not going anywhere. And then finally, the boosters come out publicly and say he needs to go. And the coach says, I'm not going anywhere. And then 6 hours later, there's a news conference and he says, guess what? I'm going somewhere else. And so you feel like we're in the middle of a cycle like this, and you just feel like it's got to stop soon, because right now it's untenable, in my view, it's untenable for Biden to continue. It's not just the age issue anymore. It's also the evaporating party support. When you have 2/3 of Democrats in polling saying they don't want him to run, 2/3 of Democrats saying they don't want him, that's a crisis.
And individuals named Pelosi, Schumer, Jeffrey, Schiff.
It's at this point, it just feels like an unstoppable amount of momentum. And of course, Biden can try to stop it. He can just go and run anyway. But he's been out here day after day doing the things that he thought could quell the problem, and they just have made everything worse. And so at some point, I feel like within days we have to reach the end game on this one way or the other, and it needs to be him stepping aside. It absolutely needs to be him stepping aside. And I do think that nervous Democrats are perhaps underestimating the sense of relief that would occur if and when he steps aside. And then also, nervous Democrats should look at some of the polling numbers that show that other Democrats, for example, in these Senate races, are polling well above Biden. I think Biden is about at the floor of where any Democrat could be against Trump right now. He is at the absolute floor, and there's nowhere to go but up.
I think he's already gone. I don't think he knows it, though. And I don't mean that he doesn't know it because he's delusional. I mean, he's doing what he's always done admirably. He's fighting the good fight. He already lost. He lost. He's already gone. He hasn't caught up to it yet. On the night of the debate, he lost. And I don't mean he lost the debate. I mean, he was done. And there's no unseeing that. And there was no amount of damage control that you can do. And it's taking him, I guess, a while to come to terms with acceptance and with the people around him. But when you have the Nancy Pelosi's and the people in Congress and everybody, it's over. It's over. And so I don't know what day exactly it's officially over. And I would love to hear, from Norm what he thinks about Harris's chances. But that's the only way that it works. I mean, they're not going to have an open convention. That's a mess. And so it seems to me like we're just waiting for the official announcement.
First, I would say on the open convention, Harry, I've got a piece in your hometown paper coming out probably later today on the ridiculous notion of an open convention. And there are not great alternatives. I will say one thing that dismayed me during Trump's speech, and as I told you earlier today, Harry, as I was listening to it, I thought I'd been transported to Havana with Fidel Castro high on LSD, going on and on.
He got number 1 and number 2, the lick spittle and Havana LSD. We've been totally smashed. Go ahead, Norm.
What dismayed me was that I could imagine Biden watching that speech and saying, I can beat this guy. I can do it. But we know the worst case scenario, as David alluded to, is that this drags on with more and more Democrats saying he's got to go and him refusing to do so. And then if you end up with this plan by the Democratic National Committee to get a vote before the convention, you're going to have an even more divided party. I mean, the party was divided in 1968, the last time we had that convention in Chicago, and it was deadly to Hubert Humphrey. It would be nothing compared to what we would see with that. So you're either going to have that vast mass of Democrats, many of whom even today are saying you've got to go back and say, okay, he's running, we're all on board. And then hoping that we don't get in September or October another meltdown. Or he's got to go probably by the weekend. And the only feasible option is to turn to Harris. There are practical reasons, the money that goes there, the offices that you don't have to give up because it's no longer Biden-Harris. But it's also that any other way you go, even if the pipe dream of many beyond the open convention is, all right, we're going to get 3 or 4 candidates, we'll have a few debates, then we'll decide at the convention. You can't do that because, first of all, you're going to have some backroom deal where you say, okay, you and you and you can run, and the rest of you can't, which is not going to play well. Or you could have a convention that extends way too long. So I think we're looking at the inevitable, and the only people at this point, I think, who have not yet embraced the inevitable are the Biden family and some of the people around Biden, and I suspect that the people around Biden know this as well. And the letter that Jamie Raskin wrote was, not surprisingly, just beautifully done, incredibly sensitive, and it makes a point that I think is so extraordinary. Biden's presidency, by any standard, coming in with the deep division in the country, the narrowest margin possible in the House and Senate, knowing you have no Republican support, and got more done than any president, at least since Lyndon Johnson, in terms of transforming the social landscape, judges and rebuilding our alliances, all the rest of it. You go out and you're going to be venerated. You stay and lose, and the only thing people are going to remember about you is that you made a selfish choice that destroyed the country. So you hope that they'll come to that conclusion. And I see that with pain because I am an enormous admirer of what Biden has been able to do as president.
And what a bum rap he's gotten from the...
Yeah. David said earlier about how Trump said he was going to cure Alzheimer's. When I look at Trump's cognitive decline, my reaction to that is he better do it quickly if he's president. But, I think we could govern perfectly well if Biden had a few more lapses along the way. But that's not the point. The point is, how do you keep this country from turning into an autocracy from which we cannot turn back in not just my lifetime, but all of our lifetimes? And you can't put your own desires, even if you believe to your core that you're the best one to do it and you can run, ahead of what is the fundamental reality. I wish I didn't have to say it, but that's the reality of it.
It's now time to take a moment for our sidebar feature, which explains some of the issues and topics that are prominent in the news. Today's sidebar explains Rule 40 of the Olympic Charter, the rule that establishes the guidelines for the participation of Olympic athletes, coaches, trainers, and other officials in commercial activities during the Games. And to explain this topic, we welcome Rosé Montgomery. Rosé is a two-time WNBA champion and the vice president and co-owner of the Atlanta Dream. After a career marked by 3 high school state championships, an undefeated NCAA title at UConn, and all sorts of WNBA accolades, Rosé retired in 2021 to become the first former player to co-own and hold an executive role in a WNBA team. I give you Rosé Montgomery on Rule 40.
As the Paris Olympics approach, images of competing athletes are beginning to crop up all over the place. Rule 40 of the Olympic Charter sets out the standard for when Olympic athletes, coaches, trainers, and other officials can participate in commercial activities during the Games. The rule prevents companies from using a name, image, or likeness without the permission of the International Olympic Committee. Generally, sponsors who pay upwards of $100 million for the rights to use Olympic rings on their ads have the widest access to Olympic advertising. These official Olympic sponsors have access to things like exclusive Olympic branding, digital and broadcast rights, and venue signage. Companies that are not official Olympic sponsors face restrictions and challenges when it comes to advertising during the Games. For instance, they can't use official Olympic symbols or logos and face restrictions when it comes to using certain hashtags on social media and images of athletes competing in the game. The bottom line is, they can't post content that could imply an official connection to the Games. The Olympic Committee recently revised Rule 40 guidelines ahead of the Paris Games as a part of an effort to reach younger audiences through non-traditional commercial platforms like TikTok. This loosening of the rule also gives athletes some ability to share in the profits generated by their likeness by referencing or reposting ads that use their images. For example, athletes can share simple messages of thanks to brand partners that are not official Olympic sponsors, and they can also repost or share content from both official Olympic sponsors and their individual brand partners. This change comes after a similar shift in college sports a few years ago, when the NCAA began to allow student athletes to directly profit from their name, image, and likeness. That's all I got for y'all. For Talking Feds, I'm Rosé Montgomery.
Thank you very much, Rosé. Rosé's podcast, Montgomery and Company, is available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we look at 3 different techniques for making rosé wine to see if there's truly a best way to rosé. First, rosé is a type of wine that's actually produced quite similarly to reds, but the fermentation time of the grape is reduced, giving rosé its signature pink color. The first technique for making rosé is the skin contact method, in which black-skinned grapes such as Pinot Noir are crushed but allowed to remain in contact with the juice for a short period of time. After about 6 to 48 hours, as opposed to weeks or months for the reds, the skins are separated. This method is most frequently used in the top rosé-producing region of the world, Provence, and throughout the south of France. The second method is called saignée, which is the French word for bleeding. This method creates both a rosé and a red wine. Early in the maceration process, some of the pink juice created from the grape must is removed to make the rosé, while the remaining juice becomes a more concentrated red. A rosé made from this method tends to be richer and darker in both color and fruit flavor. This method is more rarely used, but it can be found more often in rosés from Spain, Napa, and Chile. The third method is blending. Contrary to what some people think, blending is not just a 50-50 pour of red and white wine. Instead, blending is where a white grape, such as Chardonnay, is blended with a red grape, and it's the most popular way to make a rosé champagne. Although popular in champagne, this method is used in still rosés as well. In fact, some winemakers in Provence choose to blend small percentages of white grape varieties into their rosés. It's not always obvious or easy to know which method was used to make a particular rosé, but the expert guides at Total Wine & More can help you navigate our wondrous selection to find a rosé that makes your day. So find what you love and love what you find, only at Total Wine & More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate.
I think we're all on the same page about not only what has to be, but what is happening with Biden. Norm asserts that, it's a pipe dream to think there's a brokered convention, it has to be Harris, etc., without asking specifically about the outcome should Biden step down. Do you have a sense, as journalists and observers, that the Democrats have thought this through, that it will proceed smoothly? What's the level of concern or prospect that if Biden, and remember, he's a professional politician, he's going to see the writing on the wall, but the day after that, will the Dems, all the Dems, the disorganized Dems, I'm not a member of an organized party, I'm a Democrat, will they have it together to do the optimal, and the optimal is going to be, have problems, and solution, or is it all going to be a different kind of shit show?
I mean, we're way beyond any sort of really normal, rational process that we think could unfold. I mean, so, it's just, what's the least bad option here? It's not really the ideal. We're way beyond ideal. It's least bad. And I will say this, if Biden does step aside, and I agree with Alisyn, I think it's done. I do think it's done. He just it hadn't fully sunk into him. But if and when he steps aside, this will be an example of a party actually working in a way that we have not seen parties work for a while. And this is a party intervening for the good of the party and for the good of the country to ask somebody to step aside. So that will be a feather in the Democrats' cap if and when it happens. But then going forward, I mean, have they thought through? I think they're thinking it through, but it's the furthest thing to say that everyone's on the same page here. So it will be a kind of chaos that will happen. The question is just, will it be a moderately controlled chaos or chaotic chaos? And I'm optimistic if the Democrats can exert their will enough to get Biden to step aside, that the chaos that follows will at least be manageable. But again, we're far from ideal.
I love when I hear people in the regular world, the real world, not pundits, not journalists, friends of mine at different, dinner parties or picnics, and they say, so the Democrats are like, they have a plan, right? Like they I'm sure that they're going to surprise everybody. They're going to come out with it's going to be like a big reveal. People have a fantasy, a fever dream that there's going to be a big reveal. And behind the curtain is going to be like Gretchen Whitmer and Wes Moore. And they're going to lock arms and everybody's going to, chant and come out. And I have to tell people, do not mistake silence for a brilliant plan that they are just not unveiling yet, So I don't have any reason to believe there's some brilliant plan. I think that they're building the plane as they go. And I think that they've been waiting for Joe Biden to come around to the decision.
It's not just Biden going. Biden has to go gracefully. If he goes with some bitterness, you bastards forced me out and I was ready to take up the cudgel and beat this guy, then that's a disaster. If he is able to say, look, I really wanted to run, but I looked at this carefully. I know my health. I know that there's a risk here, and I've got to turn the reins over to a younger person. Now the next question is, do they have the right campaign team for Kamala Harris, which has to be a whole lot better than the team she put together when she flamed out running for the nomination 4 years ago. And they have to get everybody on board because her relationship with some of the people in the Biden team and on the campaign team is very tense. So you got to get the right team in place. The second thing, and she's been really good out on the trail in the last few weeks, I have to say. She's taken the message forward very well. But we know there will be hundreds of millions of dollars. Remember, Elon Musk is putting $45 million a month in to help Trump, and there will be a lot more that will then turn its guns on her. They're going to uncover every little thing they can from her role as the prosecutor in California and all the way through her life, her relationship with Willie Brown, the racist stuff that we've already seen. The DEI candidate will get worse in some ways. And if they don't have a plan for how to counter that, and if they don't have a plan for how to pivot this, which I think is doable, if it's not about Biden's age, even if it's a Biden-Harris campaign going forward, that is the Harris campaign, they can find ways to turn this into an election about Trump and what he represents. And if they are not prepared to do that, we're doomed.
All true. And of course, the issue is not just can they, but who will. There's a cacophony of voices and who will emerge as the leader. This is a great conversation. And honest to God, we are living through history. I'd like to go for hours more, and maybe we will, but not today. So we're out of time, except for our final feature of 5 words or fewer, where we take a question and each of us has to answer in 5 words or fewer. And today's question is, what's the title of J.D. Vance's next book?
I'll start. Given with the role he's playing in destroying the conservatism I know and love, it'll be just simply Conservatism, a Eulogy.
Oh.
Nice.
That's a good one. Okay. My heroes, Mama, Papa, Don Jr.
Junior, just Junior for the 5th
Okay,
word.
Junior. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'll make it simple with 2 words. Hillbilly fascist.
There you go. And I've got a similar thing, and I'm actually going to stretch the rules, which I basically never do with a underscript. So, Dr. Hillbilly, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Donald Trump. Thank you so much, Alisyn, David, and Norm. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content, including my preliminary take on Biden's withdrawal and what happens next. You can follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds is a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, Hamza Mahendranathan, David Lieberman, and Emma Maynard are our contributing writers. And production assistants by Akshaj Turbailu and Anna Salvatore. Thanks very much to Renee Montgomery for explaining Rule 40 of the Olympic Charter. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later. Now it's time for a new section of the show, Talking Back. This is a special segment featuring a question of the week that we have crowdsourced from our Patreon members. If you like the work we're doing at Talking Feds, joining our Patreon is the best way to support the show, and you'll have the chance to get your question answered on next week's show. Check out our Patreon link in the episode description. It only costs $5 a month to join. This week's question is from Eric Coleman.
Since the Constitution does not stipulate that a president has immunity, isn't it possible that Congress can go in and write a bill outside of trying to amend the Constitution, which I know is a lot more difficult? Can they write a bill stipulating that the president has no immunity from state and or federal crimes, only civil?
Eric, it's a great question because of what it illuminates about the Supreme Court's immunity opinion. The court throws around Constitution and separation of powers quite a bit, and I have no doubt that it would find that it's a constitutionally anchored doctrine, and that means that Congress almost certainly could not write a bill now stipulating that the president has no immunity from state or federal crimes, because the Supreme Court would hold that the Constitution provides otherwise, and the Constitution is the highest law, the kind of law that Congress can't simply supplant. One thing that makes it a really good question, though, is if you really zero in on the Supreme Court's opinion in the immunity decision, it seems pretty clear that they're not actually citing any sorts of constitutional provisions, but really what it is at bottom is the court's own view, or the 6-person Uber majority's own view of what makes for a nimble and effective president. It's a sort of political science kind of lesson rather than a true constitutional holding. That's as I read it. Nevertheless, I have no doubt the court would find otherwise. The court would say this is a constitutional holding, and therefore the court would say there's nothing that Congress can do about it. And in our culture, that means effectively that would be the end of the story and the effort by Congress to say no immunity for state and federal crimes is DOA. Thanks very much to Eric. To submit a question for next week's show, join our Patreon. The link is in the episode's description.